Dear viewers, our topic today is metaphysical poetry. The word metaphysical is derived from metaphysics, which is the branch of philosophical inquiry. It deals with issues that are beyond the physical, because the term meta is a Greek prefix which means beyond. These issues are by and large focused on questions that are speculative in nature. It implies that metaphysical issues are related to the discussions of things that cannot be proved to exist, yet they have acquired great importance among human cultures. Metaphysics then concerns itself with the idea of the divine, of the divinity, and of the nature of reality. Opinions, however, differ regarding the use of this term. In her book Four Metaphysical Poets, Bennett says the term metaphysical, as referred to a group of poets who wrote under the influence of John Donne, is not altogether a happy term, since it gives the impression that metaphysical poetry deals with the nature of the universe. Similarly, Dryden says somewhat disapprovingly, Donne perplexes the minds of the fair sex with nice speculations of philosophy, when he should engage their hearts and entertain them with love. As a matter of fact, the word metaphysical refers to style rather than subject matter. But style reflects an attitude to experience. It implies that the poetic experience of metaphysical poets was different from that of the other poets. Though all poets perceive likeness between different things, when metaphysical poets perceive likeness, their intellectual element dominates their emotional element. Thus, the relations they perceive between different elements are more logical than emotional. They constantly connect the abstract with the concrete, the remote with the immediate, and the sublime with the commonplace. What is more, metaphysical poets were analytic in their approach and not retrospective like Wordsworth. They analyzed their emotions as they proceeded with their poetic experience. On the other hand, Wordsworth produced poetry in moments of retrospection. Metaphysical poetry strains intellect rather than evoking emotional response, and when it evokes emotional response, that response is immediately overcome by ratiocination. Representative poets. Richard Crochet. Richard Crochet was an English poet, teacher, High Church Anglican and Roman Catholic convert. He spent the latter part of his life as an exile on the continent. According to David Dacius, Crochet is generally considered with Herbert among the religious metaphysicals, though his poetry displays a sensibility and technique equally different from Donne and from Herbert. His Steps to the Temple is inspired by Herbert's Temple, but he lacks Herbert's skill. He tries to juxtapose the secular and the divine, the sensuous and the physical, but fails to evolve the union of passion and thought, which is the hallmark of Donne's poetry. Crochet does his best to present the spiritual world in sensuous terms. Crochet's earliest work was a volume of Latin epigrams. It is the epigrammatic aspect of his work that most nearly approaches the metaphysical school. It can be seen in the following lines: O wit of love, that thus could place fountain and garden in one place. Crochet's finest poem as an English poet is the hymn to Saint Teresa. Its direct opening is worth appreciating. Love, thou art absolute, so Lord, of life and death. Crochet's nativity hymn concentrates with warm passion on the babe in the cradle. The babe whose birth embraces this morn made his own bed ere he was born. Saint Magdalene, or the Weepers, is accompanied by an emblem of the bleeding heart with the face of a weeping woman. In the poem, he plays about with the idea of Mary Magdalene's tears, which are pearls, dew, wine, spring showers, among many other things. The lines describing the eyes show hyperbolic exaggeration. Eyes, nests of milky doves, in your own wells decently washed. The imagery of Crochet's weepers in particular is derived from merino. Hence the term Marinism is applied to crochet. Like Baroque in art, the style can sometimes surprise by a fine excess, but it also drops into vulgarity. Despite his artistic efforts to awaken spiritual understanding in men, Crochet is perhaps the most misunderstood of 17th century English poets. He is usually regarded as the incongruous younger brother of the Metaphysicals, who weakens the strong line of their verse. Furthermore, Crochet is also blamed for his ardent devotion to women and his partiality for sweet, soft, or maternal images in his verse. But these aspects of his poetry are crucial to the spiritual understanding of his poetry. George Herbert. George Herbert was a Welsh poet, orator and priest of the Church of England, commonly called Anglican Church. He is recognized as one of the foremost British religious poets. His collection of religious poems, The Temple, Sacred Poems and Private Ejaculations, shows the conflict between worldly wit and Christian devotion. It also explores the significance of the beliefs of Protestant Christianity. Herbert's manner of exploring analogies between emblematic objects such as human body or parts of the church building and religious truths owes its origin to a much older Christian tradition of exegesis through emblematic or metaphorical interpretation. Herbert's combination of a simple and direct tone with ingenuity of argument and compelling intensity of feeling is metaphysical in the Donne sense, but his sensibility is undone-like or different from Donne's in that his approach towards his religious issues shows that he puts his pastoral duties above the exploration of his own relationship with God. Furthermore, he frequently employs musical devices and analogies to a greater extent than any other of the metaphysical poets. In an early sonnet, Herbert has asked, "Why are not sonnets made of thee, and lays upon thy altars burnt? Cannot thy life heighten a spirit to sound out thy praise as well as any she?" In these lines, the word thee is used to address God. Herbert wishes to bring all the resources of poetry into God's service. Yet, as a pastor, his duty is to teach religious truths simply rather than explore his religious emotions subtly. Herbert weaves together religious elements with his personal knowledge and presents his material dramatically. The theme of his poems works itself out in unexpected ways. In this regard, David Dashiell says, "The combination of shock and response in Herbert's poetry is something difficult to parallel in English literature. There is a fusion of poetic and religious element in Herbert's poetry. Redemption, church monuments, the church floor, virtue, the bunch of graves, love unknown, and color are illustrative of the fusion of poetic and religious elements." Herbert also renders the theme of his poems in their shape and textures. In order to do that, he sometimes uses pattern poetry, as in Easter Wings, and sometimes makes adjustments in the shapes of lines and makes innovations in stanza forms. Daniel is a case in point. One last comment about Herbert's religious approach. There is no search, as sometimes in Donne, for true religion. Herbert knows very well which form of Christianity is the right one. The struggle in his poetry is between the world and complete surrender to God. It is an exemplary struggle intended to serve as a guide for all Christians. Perhaps no religious poet in English has so effectively combined the strongly individual with the journal and the exemplary. Love is that liquor, sweet and most divine, which my God feels as blood, but I as wine. Herbert is also fond of using paradoxes. His poem, The repentance ends with the aphoristic line, "Fractures, well cured, make us more strong." Personification is another important characteristic of Herbert's poetry. In this respect, his poem Love the Third is a perfect example. Love bade me welcome, yet my soul drew back, guilty of dust and sin, but quick-eyed love, observing me grow sleek, from my first entrance in, drew nearer to me, sweetly questioning if I lacked anything. Henry Vaughan considers himself a disciple of George Herbert. He repudiates his own earlier love poetry and attributes the diversion of his interest towards religious poetry to George Herbert. Personal misfortune, the civil troubles of the time, and the influence of his mystical brother Thomas all helped to turn Vaughan to a poetry of religious contemplation. Though his poetry resembles that of Herbert's, his most characteristic poetry bears the stamp of his individuality. Vaughan is conscious of a veil which separates man from God and tries to penetrate the veil. It reminds us of Umar Khayyam. There was a door to which I found no key. There was a veil past which I could not see. Some little talk a while of me and thee. There seemed no more of thee and me. Vaughan is convinced that the world of nature reflects spiritual reality, as it exists on a higher level than man. I would I were a stone or tree, or spring to flow, or bird to sing. He also glorifies childhood for its innocence. Happy those early days when I shined in my angel infancy, how I long to travel back and tread again that ancient track. Vaughan's attitude to childhood in the retreat has been compared to Wordsworth's in the Immortality Ode. Moreover, his poem, The Waterfall, which is a meditation on the mystical significance of water, has been considered Wordsworthian in its attitude to nature. Summing up the salient features of his work, Saintsbury observes his love poems to Herbert and Artesia are sometimes pretty, though never distinguished. His decasyllabic couplets are based on the worst part of Donne. It is as the author of the Salix Scintillans that Vaughan holds his place. Andrew Marvell was an English metaphysical poet, satirist and politician who sat in the House of Commons at various times between 1659 and 1678. Grierson pays him tribute in these words. Andrew Marvell was only Puritan among metaphysicals who could praise Cromwell without defaming Charles. His poetry was mostly written between 1650 and 1653, when he was a tutor to Lady Fairfax at Appleton House. In his poem upon Appleton House, we find Wordsworthian touch of minute observation. And though the hazel boughs espy the hatching throstle's shining eye, his love poems are mostly tissues of conceits, but in the definition of love, the wit is daringly metaphysical. My love is of a birth as rare as 'tis for objects strange and high. It was begotten by despair upon the impossibility. Similarly, his poem On a Drop of Dew, which begins with the most accurate description of a dewdrop on a rose and then takes on transcendental significance. It symbolizes the soul's relation to heaven and earth. So the soul, that drop, that ray of the clear fountain of eternal day. Could it within the human flower be seen? The wit is integral to the poem and bound up with its accuracy of observation and its moral feeling. The nymph complaining for the death of a fawn is on the surface a simple poem in gently moving octosyllabic couplets, but in the words of T.S. Eliot, Marvell takes a slight affair, the feeling of a girl for her pet, and gives a connection with that emotion which surrounds all our practical passions. Eliot suggests that the feeling is expressed in the poem so compellingly that the reader's empathy is immediately called into play. Thenceforth I set myself to play my solitary time away with this, and very well content could so mine idle life have spent, for it was full of sport and light of foot and heart, and did invite me to its game. It seemed to bless itself in me. How could I less than love it? Oh, I cannot be unkind to a beast that loved me. Marvel's poems are very unequal. The Mower poems show his love of nature put at the service of a moral theme. The well-known Bermudas is quite perfect of its kind. It describes the feelings of a group of pilgrims who fled from the religious persecution of Lord the Archbishop of Canterbury and found refuge in one of the islands of the group known as Bermudas. It strikes an unholy and cheerful note to a degree rarely equaled in English poetry. Marvel's satirical verse is less impressive than his lyrical poetry. Thus, last instructions to a painter, a satirical poem is actually a verse comment in contemporary affairs in the form of advice. Much more accurate are Marvel's prose writings in the defense of religious toleration. Dear viewers, in the second part of this lecture, we shall be discussing some important aspects of the poetry of John Donne, who is the greatest metaphysical poet. Thank you very much.